they don't want Putin to lose. They have invested a lot. The Chinese leader has invested a lot in that relationship. A loss for the Russians will make the people of Taiwan more confident of their position. And so the Chinese really are stuck in a bit of a bind right now.
China is considering giving Russia weapons and ammunition for the Ukraine war. That's according to the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He told a CBS News special that Chinese companies were already providing non-lethal support to Russia and that new information suggested that Beijing could provide lethal support. It comes as the Secretary of State held talks with Chinese officials at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, with the suspected Chinese spy balloon high on the agenda. Well, Dennis Wilder is a former National Security Council director for China and a former special assistant to President George W. Bush. He was also a China advisor to the CIA for a while. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking what exactly it meant by non-legal support that China were believed to be supplying.
One of the successes of the Biden administration in dealing with the Chinese is that early on in the Ukraine war, the administration made it very clear to the Chinese that they needed to stay out of the conflict. Now, the Chinese for a long time seemed to be abiding by that, but then the administration got intelligence that they were beginning to send such things as body armor and maybe uniforms, helmets, these kinds of non-lethal assistance to the Russians. And that got people in Washington a little worried, but not terribly worried. But what is obvious now is that the Biden administration has received intelligence that shows the Chinese may be going beyond those limits to actually supplying military goods to the Russian forces.
Right. And so, as we understand it, is that China considering providing things like ammunition, or they could already be currently providing things like ammunition?
The language used by Secretary Blinken was China is considering this. So one of the things they are trying to do, and the reason they raised it as high as they did, the czar of Chinese foreign policy, Wang Yi, who he met with, is going from Munich to Moscow and actually will be there tomorrow. And their worry is that what Wang Yi is there to do is set up the meeting with Xi Jinping coming to Moscow for the first time in 4 years, sometime this spring. And they don't want him bringing gifts to his friend, Mr. Putin.
Gifts as in ammunition?
As in ammunition, perhaps drones. There are plenty of things that the Chinese have that would be extremely useful to Russian military forces.
Right.
They have much more sophisticated drones, for example, than the Iranian drones.
Right. And that would be clearly a line crossed, wouldn't it, for Biden, for the administration, and for the West in general, you would imagine. What kind of response?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What kind of response would that require, do you think, from the West?
Well, the Biden administration is being a little cagey on that subject. They're not saying what they would do. But some of the economic sanctions that have been put on Russia could be put on China as well. For example, use of this international transaction system called the SWIFT could be something that might be imposed on the Chinese. Direct sanctions on whatever companies and individuals are involved in the transfer of military goods to Russia. There are a lot of sanctionable activities that the administration could consider.
Right. What would you do?
Well, I think that it's very smart at this point to flag it, to say we've got some intelligence on this to the Chinese, and you better back away from this. I think also, quite frankly, we need to take the heat out of this balloon gate issue in some way, shape, or form. We've got to get by that in the relationship. The administration has made its point clearly on the balloon issue by shooting it down, by rejecting China's claim that it was a civilian balloon. I think what the administration needs to do now is really talk less about that issue, so that it doesn't become a major irritant that makes it difficult to discuss these other very important issues.
Right. And I suppose they may feel that if they have solid enough evidence that it was a Chinese balloon and suspect it heavily enough of being a surveillance operation, that China refusing to acknowledge that, or even, I mean, an apology may be too much to ask for, but at least an acknowledgement, that is a roadblock to them getting over that issue.
Exactly, and there's a major dynamic here, and that is the Congress and the politicians on Capitol Hill who are keeping a very sharp eye on the Biden administration and want some sort of Chinese acknowledgement and basically are demanding that the administration continue to push this issue. So that's a difficulty for the Biden administration.
Okay. Dennis, can I just return to the issue of sanctions against China then?
Yeah.
Were it to be the case that ammunitions, lethal assistance was provided to Russia by China, sanctions such as you pointed towards the SWIFT payment system. Now we saw that, didn't we,
Hmm.
at the outbreak of the war, that Russia were
Right.
cut off from that system. I mean, that is that's a really would have a really profound
It
economic
would.
impact.
It would.
And I think it's fair to say that China and the West are much more closely aligned economically than Russia and the West
Right.
were.
Right.
There are businesses and organizations across the West that massively rely on having a fluid relationship with China in terms of goods and economic movement. That would be an enormously damaging, wouldn't it?
You're absolutely right, and I'm not saying that they would necessarily go in that direction, at least not immediately, but they might threaten that. But the other thing I would say is if you look at the actions of the Biden administration, for example, the decision last October to severely limit Chinese access to semiconductor technology, they've gone farther than any administration has gone in sanctioning the Chinese. So, the National Security Advisor and the president are not above moving ahead on sanctions in an unprecedented fashion. So, if I were in Beijing, I'd take the threats from the United States quite seriously at this point.
How concerned are they about that, do you think, in Beijing?
Oh, I think that's kept them out of the war so far. I think they've seen what the administration was willing to do with Russia, which, as you said, was unprecedented and quite dramatic. And they certainly, with their economy struggling, um, unemployment rates high in China, they certainly don't want that to happen to them. And so I think they will take it very seriously. But that doesn't mean they might not do something. And the reason is they don't want Putin to lose. They have invested a lot. The Chinese leader has invested a lot in that relationship. A loss for the Russians will make the people of Taiwan more confident of their position. And so the Chinese really are stuck in a bit of a bind right now.
Hmm. There's always felt, to a degree, Dennis, that China also presents an opportunity for the West as being
Absolutely.
a sort of an external actor that can put pressure on Vladimir Putin. Xi Jinping having the ear of Vladimir Putin in the way that he does to perhaps nudge him to rethinking his strategy. Is that still a prospect on the table at this point?
Well, it's very interesting. Wang Yi, of course, during the Munich summit, talked about a Chinese peace plan, which is not very well conceived, as far as I can tell, and probably doesn't have much of a future on its own. But it does show that the Chinese, when Xi Jinping goes to Moscow, or indeed when Wang Yi goes tomorrow, they will probably be trying to explore ideas with the Russians of how to get a ceasefire, how to lower the level of this conflict. Again, it's not their interest for the Russians to lose. And if they are evaluating that Russia may be on the edge of a disaster here, it would be in their interest to see if they could get Moscow to move toward, at least at a minimum, ceasefire.
Hmm. You mentioned the peace plan there, Dennis. What more do we know about
Mhm.
the peace plan? We're expecting a speech, aren't we, by Xi Jinping at some point in the not too distant future about that
Right.
proposal?
Yeah, I've seen one report that suggests on the anniversary of the invasion he might make that speech. I'm not entirely clear. Um, I don't know that the Chinese have gone much beyond what Wang Yi said in public, and again, it was quite vague. But they clearly think that it resonates with the West. They wouldn't have announced it in Europe if they didn't think the Europeans would be interested in the ideas. So, in that sense, it's a bit of the new charm offensive the Chinese have been doing toward Europe, wanting Europeans to come back to China in a big way in business. The opening up of China again to the world has been a big theme. Since the zero COVID was lifted. So I think this is part and parcel of trying to woo European governments back to thinking more positively about China, because mood in Europe has indeed soured on China recently.
Mm. Do you think that that has the potential to be successful?
Depends. Honestly, the Chinese have not been terribly good at unilaterally working issues like this. A large scale mediation diplomacy is not their strength. They're not used to doing this sort of thing. But if they want to demonstrate they are a better global player than we see them as now, this certainly would be an area where they could score some points.
We also saw Dennis Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with Chinese officials at the Munich Security Conference yesterday. From your vantage point, was that a successful meeting?
No, it was not a successful meeting. Both sides were playing to their domestic audiences quite clearly in that meeting, and were really not in a mood to compromise. I think Blinken probably hopes that the meeting will lead to a rescheduling sometime in late March of his visit to Beijing. But he came out very strong and very tough with the Chinese, I think in part to show the Congress again that the administration is taking this issue very seriously. The interesting thing about the Chinese side, I've been reading the Chinese newspapers today, and they don't even call it a meeting. They call it an informal contact or an informal engagement that the United States requested with Wang Yi, almost as if they met in the cafeteria. It was very little coverage of what was said by either side. So, from the Chinese point of view, because the U.S. is still in a relatively aggressive mode on this subject, I think they took the meeting very reluctantly.
Dennis Wilder, former National Security Council Director for China and a former special assistant to President George W. Bush,